The bus coughed a final, asthmatic sigh, its air brakes hissing loudly as it settled onto the cracked asphalt of Port Blossom's tiny terminal. A fine, pale dust, disturbed by the sudden stop, billowed up around the tires, catching the late afternoon sun before slowly, lazily, descending onto the scuffed vinyl seats and the worn-out suitcases piled haphazardly beside the station's single, peeling bench. Anna stepped down, the metal steps groaning under her weight, and the humid July air of 1982 wrapped around her like a damp wool blanket. It was thick with the scent of pine needles baking on sun-warmed earth, a familiar, comforting smell, undercut by the faint, sweet decay of lake water drifting in from the unseen shoreline. She pulled her worn canvas duffel bag tighter over her shoulder, the familiar weight of it a small, solid comfort against the sudden, heavy quiet of the town. After the rumbling vibration of the bus, the stillness felt almost oppressive, a vast, echoing space. Her sneakers, scuffed from a term of Toronto pavement, felt strange on the uneven, granular surface of the terminal lot. Her father, Frank, was already there, leaning against the pale blue paintwork of his Ford Cortina, one hand tucked into his trousers pocket. He pushed himself off the car as she approached, a wide, almost theatrical smile stretching his lips, but his eyes, she noticed, held a familiar, restless quality. "Anna, there's my girl. Good trip?" He clapped her on the back, a little too hard, the impact jarring her just as she was trying to balance the duffel. "How was Toronto? University treating you right?" His voice boomed, perhaps a touch too loud for the sleepy quiet of the terminal. He kept the questions coming, a rapid-fire volley about her studies, her friends, her plans for the summer, but his gaze, she saw, kept darting over her head, past the low-slung roof of the bus station, towards the shimmering, distant expanse of the lake. A nervous tick, she'd learned to recognize. The drive home was short, the familiar winding road bordered by dense, dark green trees. Anna offered brief, polite answers to her father's questions, trying to inject some genuine enthusiasm into her voice, but a part of her was already bracing for the return to the house. It stood, just as she remembered it, a solid, two-story structure with a neatly trimmed lawn and a porch swing that never seemed to get used. Inside, the air was thick, not just with the humid summer heat, but with the distinct, sharp scent of her mother's lemon polish. A scent that always seemed to signify a surface scrubbed clean of everything but the unspoken. Eleanor, her mother, emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a tea towel. She moved through the house with a quiet precision, her footsteps barely audible on the polished hardwood floors, her movements economical, almost ritualistic. Her face, etched with a familiar, deep-seated melancholy that Anna had never quite managed to understand, offered a small, polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hello, dear. Had a good journey?" Her voice was soft, distant. The rotary phone sat silent on the counter, a beige plastic relic of a slower time, its cord coiled neatly. On the small, chipped radio beside it, the local station played a soft rock ballad, its melancholic chords seeming to underscore the stillness, the heavy quiet that settled over the house like a shroud. Anna felt the familiar, stifling weight of it, the walls humming with decades of forgotten conversations and lingering shadows. She tried to chat, to bridge the gap that always seemed to widen, yawning wider with each visit home. She spoke about her classes, a funny incident with her roommate, the vibrancy of the city. Eleanor listened, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond Anna's shoulder, her responses clipped, distant. "That's nice, dear. Oh, indeed, it was always like this." The words felt like pebbles dropped into a deep well, making only the faintest ripple before disappearing into the profound silence. Later that afternoon, the quiet of the house pressing in on her, Anna found herself needing air, a breath of something different. She walked down to the main street, her duffel bag left abandoned in her childhood bedroom. The street was sleepy, a few cars parked at odd angles, a lone dog sniffing at a lamppost. The diner, the Anchor, still smelled exactly as she remembered, a potent mix of stale coffee, frying grease, and something faintly metallic. The bell above the door jingled as she pushed it open, a sound that always felt like a small, private welcome. Mark, her childhood friend, was behind the counter, flipping burgers with a practiced, almost bored ease. His hair was a little longer now, brushed back from his forehead, and his shoulders seemed broader under the faded denim of his work shirt. But the same mischievous glint was still in his eyes, a spark of familiar irreverence that made a small, tight knot in Anna's chest loosen. "Well, look what the bus dragged in," he grinned, wiping his hands on his apron. "Thought you'd forgotten all about us small-town folk." They talked for a long time, the easy camaraderie of shared history flowing between them like an unspoken current. They spoke of nothing and everything: the ridiculous antics of old high school teachers, the unchanging pace of Port Blossom, the bewildering complexity of university life. Mark leaned against the counter, a half-wiped glass in his hand, his eyes scanning the empty diner. "Nothing ever changes here, you know," he mused, a faint bitterness in his tone. "The lake just keeps pulling people back, like a big, watery magnet." He paused, his gaze drifting towards the window, where a sliver of the lake could be seen between two buildings. A flicker, quick as a fish darting beneath the surface, crossed his eyes. "Though some things," he added, his voice dropping, "they stay buried deeper than the lake itself." Anna felt a prickle of unease, a cold sensation that started in her stomach and spread outwards. The casualness of his words, coupled with that brief, intense look, suggested a weight she couldn't quite grasp. She wanted to ask, to push for more, but the moment passed. Mark straightened up, a forced cheerfulness returning to his face. "Another coffee, Anna? On the house?" The conversation shifted back to lighter topics, but the unsettling image of something, buried deeper than the lake, lingered, a shadow at the edge of her thoughts. A few days later, the oppressive quiet of the house still a constant companion, Anna found herself helping her mother clear out the dusty attic. Sunlight, thick with motes of dust, streamed through a small, grimy window, illuminating forgotten treasures and junk alike. The air was hot and dry, heavy with the scent of old paper and mothballs. Eleanor moved with her usual methodical pace, sorting through boxes, her expression unreadable. "Dad, I found an old photo today, in the attic. Of you and some friends. There was a guy named Josh." Anna's voice, usually steady, held a slight tremor she tried to hide, as if testing the air. She watched her father from across the breakfast table, a half-eaten piece of toast forgotten in her hand. Frank, who had been engrossed in the morning paper, lowered it slowly. His posture stiffened, a subtle tension settling into his shoulders. He cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound, then adjusted the knot of his tie with an almost imperceptible twitch of his fingers. The gesture was too deliberate, too swift. "Old friends, Anna," he said, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond her, out the window at the shimmering lake. His voice was sharper than usual, a thin, cutting edge to words that were meant to be dismissive, a clear, unmistakable signal to drop the subject immediately. He didn't even look at her. Instead, he folded the newspaper with a precise, almost violent snap, and then launched into a detailed, almost performative explanation of the day's local fishing report, his eyes finally settling on the flickering television screen in the corner. He spoke of water temperatures, bait choices, and the migratory patterns of pike, effectively shutting down any further questions, his words a wall built of mundane facts. Anna felt the abrupt chill in the room, the sudden distance that had sprung up between them. The lake, usually a place of comfort and summer memories, its familiar scent of pine and cool water a constant presence, now felt different to Anna, its vast, shimmering surface suddenly holding a deeper, more unsettling secret. It was as if the very air around her father had thickened, making it impossible to breathe freely. Later that evening, long after her parents had retreated to their bedroom, Anna found herself staring out at the lake from her own window, the distant lights across the water mirroring the unanswered questions forming in her mind. The silence of the house pressed in around her, amplifying the thrum of her own thoughts. An old, dilapidated boathouse, half submerged near the far shore, caught her eye, a forgotten structure, its weathered timbers slowly succumbing to the water, much like the memory of Josh seemed to be. She couldn't shake the image of Josh's bright, boyish smile from the faded photograph, or the way her mother had subtly flinched, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, when Anna had first mentioned his name. The quiet unease had begun to fester, a dull ache beneath her ribs. The next day, the sun was high and hot, baking the asphalt of the marina. The air hummed with the buzz of insects and the distant drone of boat engines. Anna found Mark there, his head bent over an outboard motor, its guts exposed on a workbench. The smell of oil and gasoline hung heavy in the air. He was wiping grease from his hands with a rag, his brow furrowed in concentration. She approached him cautiously, describing the photo, the young man with the wide smile, the way his hair fell across his forehead. "Josh," she said, carefully, "from that old picture." Mark paused, his wrench still in his hand, his eyes distant for a moment. He straightened up slowly, his gaze sweeping the marina, as if checking for eavesdroppers among the scattered boats and fishing gear. "Josh Miller," he said, his voice dropping to a low, almost conspiratorial tone. "Yeah, everyone knew Josh. Good guy. Then he just vanished." He shook his head, a faint shadow passing over his face. He leaned against the workbench, his arms crossed. "My grandfather used to talk about it, back when I was a kid. Said Josh was last seen at a party, down by the old Narrows, near where your dad and his buddies used to hang out. Big party, summer of '78, I think. Hot summer. Then nothing. Official story was he drowned, went out on the lake in a storm. But they never found a body, not really. Just a few bits of his boat, washed up weeks later, splintered wood, a life jacket." Mark's eyes, usually so open and friendly, met hers with a silent understanding, a shared acknowledgement of the unspoken. "Some folks say it was more than just an accident. But nobody ever talks about it anymore. Not out loud. Not in this town." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning, leaving Anna with a chilling certainty that there was indeed something more. Driven by a growing sense of unease, a knot tightening in her stomach, Anna sought out Mrs. Peterson. The old woman lived in a small, weather-beaten cottage on the far side of the lake, its windows like rheumy eyes watching the water, perpetually shrouded in a thin film of dust. Mrs. Peterson was known for her reclusive nature, her life a quiet rhythm of tending to her garden and watching the lake, but also for her encyclopedic, almost unnerving memory of Port Blossom's past. The cottage smelled of dried herbs and old paper. The old woman, frail but with surprisingly sharp, bird-like eyes, offered Anna a cup of weak, lukewarm tea in a chipped floral mug. "You're Frank's girl," she rasped, her gaze piercing, seeming to see right through Anna. "Got your mother's eyes. Always looking for something, aren't you?" Anna felt a blush creep up her neck, a strange mix of discomfort and a dawning sense of being understood. She tentatively brought up Josh Miller's name, the words feeling heavy on her tongue. Peterson's face, already a roadmap of wrinkles, tightened further, her lips pressing into a thin line. She took a slow sip of her tea. "The lake knows its secrets, child," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It keeps them deep. But sometimes, the water stirs, and things come to the surface, whether we want them to or not." She spoke of a specific night, a fierce summer storm, the kind that whipped the lake into a frenzy, tearing at the trees, making the old cottage creak and groan. The year, she recalled, was '78, the same year Mark had mentioned. Frank and Robert, they were always together. Thick as thieves, those two. Inseparable. A faint, almost imperceptible shake of her head. And Josh? He had a way of getting under people's skin. A quick temper, but a laugh that could charm the birds from the trees. Mrs. Peterson leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, forcing Anna to lean in, too. "There was a boat, a small one, and a loud argument. Heard it from my porch, clear as day, over the wind and the rain. Shouting. Then, silence. An abrupt, unnatural silence. And then, the silence of the town. Much louder, that." She paused, her eyes fixed on Anna's, then hinted at Anna's grandfather, a respected but stern man, a pillar of the community, orchestrating a quiet disappearance of the truth, a careful sweeping of unpleasantness under the rug. The implication was clear. The town had chosen to forget, or rather, had been made to forget. As Anna's inquiries became less subtle, a palpable tension settled over their small house. Her mother, Eleanor, grew more withdrawn, her movements slow and deliberate, as if wading through thick water. She spent hours staring out at the lake, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze vacant, lost in some distant, private sorrow. Her father, on the other hand, became overtly dismissive, almost aggressive in his attempts to shut down Anna's questions. The polite veneer of their family life began to crack, revealing a raw, uncomfortable truth. One tense family dinner, the clinking of cutlery sounding unnaturally loud in the strained silence. Anna mentioned the newspaper archives she'd been looking at, the sparse, almost non-existent reports of Josh's disappearance. The words hung in the air, a challenge. Frank slammed his fork down on his plate, the sound echoing through the dining room. His face was flushed, his jaw tight. "What is wrong with you, Anna?" he demanded, his voice rising, a sharp edge of anger she rarely heard. "Are you trying to stir up trouble? To dig up old ghosts? Some things are best left buried. You think you know better than everyone else, coming back here with your university ideas, poking into things that don't concern you." The outburst left a ringing silence in the dining room, the air thick with unspoken accusations. Her mother flinched, a small, involuntary movement, her eyes, wide and filled with a desperate plea, fixed on Anna, begging her to drop it, to just let it go. But Anna, though shaken, felt a stubborn resolve harden within her. The plea in her mother's eyes, rather than deterring her, only fueled her need to know. Undeterred, Anna spent more time at the dusty local library. The air was cool and still, smelling of old paper and furniture polish. She combed through microfiche, the flickering green screen illuminating her determined face in the dim light. The whirring of the machine was the only sound. The newspaper articles confirmed Mark's story, echoing the thinness of the official record. A brief, almost apologetic mention of a missing boater, Josh Miller, followed weeks later by a report of scattered debris found near the Narrows. No body. No further investigation. It was eerily thin, a story half told, then abandoned. It felt like a deliberate erasure. As she scrolled through the faded pages, her eyes aching, she found a small, almost hidden notice, tucked away in the back pages from that year. A tiny paragraph she nearly missed. A commendation for Officer Davies, who had handled the initial report, for diligent service. He was now retired, living on the outskirts of town, a detail that felt like a lifeline. Anna found Officer Davies in his small, overgrown garden, tending to wilting tomatoes. The sun beat down on his stooped back. He was a quiet, stoic man, his uniform long replaced by faded overalls, his hands gnarled from years of work. The scent of rich earth and tomato plants filled the air. When Anna introduced herself and, with a deep breath, mentioned Josh Miller, a shadow passed over his face, like a cloud briefly obscuring the sun. He straightened up slowly, wiping his hands on his overalls, his gaze distant. He invited her in, his voice gruff but not unkind, offering her a glass of iced tea that tasted faintly of mint. "That was a long time ago, miss," Davies said, settling into a worn armchair, his hands resting heavily on his knees. "A very long time." He was hesitant, clearly uncomfortable, his eyes flicking to the window, then back to Anna, as if weighing something unseen. Anna spoke softly, carefully, explaining her family connection, her mother's quiet sadness, her father's defensiveness, the town's strange silence. She told him about Mrs. Peterson's hints, about the inconsistencies in the official story. She didn't accuse, she merely laid out the facts, the questions that gnawed at her. Slowly, painstakingly, as if unearthing old bones, Davies began to speak. His voice was a low rumble, filled with a weary resignation. He revealed that the initial investigation had been cut short, almost immediately. Orders had come down from above, he said, from influential families in town, particularly Anna's grandfather, a powerful figure in the community, a man whose word carried weight. "It wasn't a murder, miss," Davies said, his gaze fixed on a faded photograph on his mantelpiece. "Not in the way you might think. It was an accident. A fight, alcohol, a fall. Josh hit his head, fell into the lake. Your father and his friend Robert, they panicked. They were young, scared. They thought they'd ruined their lives. They weighted him down, sank the boat. Made it look like he just disappeared." The old officer looked at her then, his eyes full of a profound, weary regret that seemed to have settled deep within him over decades. "I knew. I suspected. Saw the signs. But I was just a young officer. What could I do against the whole town, against the men who ran it?" "Against your grandfather?" His words hung in the quiet living room, heavy with the weight of a long-held secret, a burden shared and finally, partially, released. The truth, whispered in the quiet of Davy's living room, hit Anna with the force of a physical blow. Her head swam, the world tilting on its axis. The familiar landscape of her childhood suddenly felt alien, tainted. She returned home, her mind reeling, the words echoing in her ears, each one a hammer blow. She found her mother in the living room, staring blankly at the television, a daytime soap opera playing to an empty room, its cheerful voices a jarring contrast to the turmoil in Anna's heart. Eleanor's hands were clasped in her lap, her knuckles white. "Mom," Anna began, her voice trembling, barely a whisper. "I know about Josh." Eleanor flinched violently, as if struck, her hands flying to her mouth, stifling a gasp. Her eyes, already clouded with unspoken grief, welled with tears, silent rivers tracing paths down her weathered cheeks. For a moment, she was frozen, a statue of despair. Then, the dam finally broke, a torrent of confession pouring out, words tumbling over each other, desperate to escape. "It was an accident, Anna, truly," she sobbed, her voice thick with anguish, clutching at Anna's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "A drunken argument at a party, down by the Narrows. Your father and Robert, they were arguing with Josh, something stupid about a girl, a misunderstanding, the way young men do when they've had too much to drink. Josh pushed Robert, Robert pushed back. Josh lost his footing, hit his head on the dock, and fell into the lake. He didn't come back up." Her mother dissolved into deeper sobs, her body shaking. "They panicked, Anna. They were so young, so terrified. They thought their lives were over. Your grandfather, he helped them. He helped them hide it." The words were a raw, aching wound, finally exposed to the light. The words hung in the air, heavy and thick, like the humid summer air before a storm. "He said it was the only way to protect them, to protect our family. I've lived with it every single day, Anna. The guilt, the silence. Please, don't expose it. It will destroy everything." Her father's voice had cracked on the last word, the sound raw and unfamiliar. Anna had stared at him across the kitchen table, the familiar surface now feeling like a battleground. He had initially met her accusations with a terrifying, almost theatrical rage. "You listen to old gossips and senile policemen, Anna? You'd rather believe them than your own father?" His face, usually so composed, had contorted into a mask of indignation, his jaw tight, eyes blazing. He'd pounded a fist on the table, making the sugar bowl jump. But Anna had held her ground, her own voice surprisingly steady as she recounted Davy's careful, pained words, the details Mark had corroborated, and finally, the memory of her mother's tear-stained face, her quiet, broken confession from years ago. Each sentence was a hammer blow against his defenses. Slowly, agonizingly, the anger had drained from him, leaving behind a hollowed-out vulnerability. His shoulders, usually so broad and unyielding, seemed to slump inward. He moved like an old man suddenly, his gaze dropping to the checkered linoleum floor. The fight had left him. He shuffled towards the armchair in the living room, a worn leather sentinel that had seen decades of family dramas, and collapsed into it, his face buried in his hands. A raw, guttural sound tore from his throat, A sound Anna had never heard before, a noise of pure, unadulterated anguish. It was an accident, he choked out, the words thick with the weight of decades of suppressed guilt, muffled by his palms. We were young, stupid, drunk. Robert pushed him, but I was there. I helped. We thought our lives would be over. My father, he said he would handle it. He said we had futures, that one mistake shouldn't ruin everything. He looked up then, his eyes bloodshot and rheumy, fixed on some distant, terrible memory. The town. They would have ostracized us. Robert and we were supposed to be something. He gestured vaguely, a hand trembling. We covered it up, and we've lived with it ever since. The confession was not a sudden burst of catharsis, but a slow, painful bleed. The weight of the secret, the decades of lies, the quiet suffering of his wife, and now his own, seemed to physically crush him in that moment, shrinking him before her eyes. Later that evening, the air still thick with the ghosts of spoken truths, Anna walked down to the lake. The moon was a sliver, a pale fingernail clipping in the vast expanse of the night sky, barely illuminating her path through the whispering pines. She found the spot Mark had described, near the skeletal remains of the abandoned boathouse, its timbers rotting, half submerged in the dark water. The water lapped gently against the shore, a deceptive calm that belied the turmoil beneath. The beauty of the place, the tranquil shimmer of the lake under the moonlight, was now irrevocably tainted for her. It was no longer just a place of childhood summer fun, of cannonballs and sun-drenched afternoons, but a silent witness, a grave. She closed her eyes, imagining Josh, young and vibrant, full of life, now lost to its cold, indifferent depths. A shiver ran through her, not from the evening chill, but from the stark reality of it all. A soft crunch of gravel announced Mark's arrival. He didn't say anything, just moved to stand beside her, a quiet, solid presence. He didn't ask if she was okay, didn't offer platitudes. He simply stood, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder, a silent testament to their shared understanding of the town's hidden grief, a comfort that needed no words. The lake continued its soft lapping, the only sound breaking the quiet communion of their shared burden. The weight of the truth settled on Anna's shoulders, heavy and cold, a burden now shared not just with Mark, but with her family, and in a strange way, with the town itself. She grappled with what to do, the impossible choice pressing down on her. Exposing the decades-old secret would shatter her family, ruin her father and Robert's lives, tear the fragile fabric of Port Blossom apart, unearthing a scandal that the town had meticulously buried. But keeping it silent, however, meant perpetuating the lie, living under the same suffocating shadow that had consumed her mother for so long, a shadow that had now fallen over her. The choice felt impossible, a tightrope walk between justice and destruction, a chasm on either side. She spent days in a quiet torment, walking the lake paths, the whispers of the wind through the pines sounding like forgotten voices, Josh's voice, her mother's silent grief. Her sleep was restless, filled with fragmented images of her father's broken face and the shimmering, deceptive surface of the lake. She needed to talk to Mark again, to untangle the knotted threads in her mind. They sat on the old dock, their feet dangling in the cool water, the sun warm on their faces, a stark contrast to the chill in her heart. He listened patiently as she wrestled with her conscience, his understanding gaze unwavering, never interrupting. He just let her talk, the way he always did. "It's not just about right or wrong anymore, is it?" he murmured finally, skipping a flat stone across the surface of the water, watching it dance before sinking. "It's about what happens next. To everyone." Anna nodded, a lump forming in her throat. She knew a public confession, a grand expose, would only create more victims, more pain, more broken lives. But she also knew she couldn't simply walk away and pretend the secret didn't exist. She couldn't let Josh Miller remain just a forgotten name, a ghost in the lake, his memory swallowed by the town's complicit silence. Perhaps the truth didn't need to be shouted from the rooftops to bring change. Perhaps it needed to be acknowledged, quietly, for those who truly needed to hear it, for those who carried its silent weight. She considered writing about it, anonymously, a fictionalized account that would still carry the emotional truth. A story that would echo Josh's existence without directly implicating her father and Robert. Or perhaps finding a way to contribute to a local historical society, subtly ensuring Josh's existence wasn't entirely erased. A quiet insertion of his name, his life, into the town's collective memory. The path forward was murky, but the decision was forming, not destruction, but a quiet reckoning. A way to acknowledge the past without completely destroying the present. Anna had a final, quiet conversation with her father and mother before she left. There was no grand scene of forgiveness, no easy absolution, no tearful embrace of reconciliation. Instead, there was a shared understanding, a fragile truce in the long war against the past. Her father, stripped bare of his defenses, looked older, smaller, his face etched with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. But in his eyes, a glimmer of something new flickered, perhaps a path towards a quiet repentance. A life lived with a different kind of honesty, a burden lifted, even if only slightly. He didn't offer apologies, and she didn't demand them. It was enough, for now, that the truth had been spoken, acknowledged. Her mother, for the first time in Anna's memory, seemed a fraction lighter, as if a small part of the immense weight she'd carried for decades had finally been lifted, simply by speaking the truth aloud, by having it heard. The lines of tension around her mouth softened, and she even managed a small, genuine smile. The silence in the house was no longer suffocating, no longer filled with unspoken resentments and buried fears, but a quieter, more honest space. A space where perhaps, healing could begin. A week later, the summer days already beginning to shorten, Anna packed her duffel bag again. The worn canvas felt lighter this time, even with her clothes inside. The bus was due to arrive shortly, its rumble already a distant promise on the highway. She hugged her mother, a longer, more tender embrace than usual, a silent exchange of understanding passing between them, a quiet strength transferred. Her mother held her tightly, a small, almost imperceptible squeeze. Her father simply held her gaze, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, a recognition of the shared burden, the difficult truth, and the fragile hope for a different future. He didn't speak, just nodded once, a gesture that spoke volumes. As the bus pulled away from Port Blossom, the familiar houses shrinking in the rearview mirror, Anna looked back. The town still held its secrets, undoubtedly many more than she had uncovered. The quaint Main Street, the old general store, the familiar faces waving from porches, they all carried their own hidden stories. But she was different. She had faced her family's truth, understood its cost, and carried its burden. She was no longer just Anna, the university student returning home for the summer, but Anna, who carried the quiet truth of Port Blossom. A truth that had changed her irrevocably. The lake still shimmered, beautiful and serene under the afternoon sun, its surface reflecting the endless sky, but its depths were no longer a mystery to her. She looked back, not with resentment, but with a quiet, melancholic acceptance, a profound understanding of the complexities of human choices and their lasting echoes. The future was uncertain, for her family, for the town, and for herself. But she had found her voice within the silence, a voice that would no longer allow the past to remain entirely buried. The bus picked up speed, the town fading into the distance, but the image of the shimmering lake, its secrets now known, remained vivid in her mind, a quiet promise of a truth that would, in time, find its way to the surface. She closed her eyes, the gentle sway of the bus a comforting rhythm, carrying her away, but not truly leaving anything behind. How was the story today? I want to show you a memorable scene. If there's a moment that overlaps with my memory, the story of that time, the scenery in my memory that I used to go to often, I feel for someone I can't meet anymore, the small things that come to mind right now, please leave it as a detail. If you're curious about a story that's released at the same time every day, subscriptions and notification settings are very helpful in creating videos.